Okay, welcome. Thank you for registering and attending the workshop hosted through the Pollinator Stewardship Council. My name is Jennifer Bryan Goforth, and I work with PSC. I am the director and get to do a lot of, I think, really meaningful and important work to protect pollinators. And I get to work with just a fantastic board of directors. We have this really good working board. And I'll talk a little bit more as we kind of go through this. Let me turn off my video here. Okay. So hopefully you can all see the first slide in the slide deck. Um, uh, Before I get started, I want to also just kind of share some of my experience or the reason that I am teaching this particular workshop. So aside from being involved in the PSC, I also have a lot of experience as an organic and regenerative farmer. So I've been on the same piece of land for 25 years, growing food and doing all kinds of stuff related to growing and preserving my own food. And I've been a market farmer, and we have had a CSA before. I do lots of food preservation, and we do a big seed distribution project where we grow, package, and distribute about 10,000 packages of seed every year. And we do that to help increase food sovereignty and for backyard gardeners. So I have lots of practical experience with some of this stuff too. And this is a really huge topic. I will just say that I also work for a university extension, and I teach a 12-week class a series called Grow Your Groceries. And so we spend 90 minutes every week talking about this kind of thing. And I would say that pretty easily the first 8 weeks could be of class could be spent and would have a focus that related to improving health for bees. So I'm taking all of that and kind of really condensing it down into this very quick kind of lunch and learn. So there are definitely going to be gaps, but I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm happy to provide more information if needed. So I appreciate your kind of understanding. I just kind of want to give that overview. So when we're talking about pollinator friendly gardens, collectively, we may have very different experience and adding up to kind of quite a lot of experience with gardening. Some folks may have been doing this for many years, and maybe they're just starting to lean a little more heavily into wanting to make sure that they're supporting pollinators in their efforts. Some folks are coming from the opposite angle. They have our opposite approach where they are really excited about bees and they want to do some gardening to help support bees specifically. So, lots of different experience here. We're going to kind of cover why plan your garden with bees in mind. Like, why would that be something that might be important? We'll talk about some gardening methods, crop selection and varietal selection, some integrated pest management practices, and some seed saving. So just a little bit of each thing. And what I would love is if people would be willing to put any questions in the chat. I'm going to try to save 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more at the end to answer some questions. And if the question is even how do I get more information on this, that's totally great. Uh, any comments, those can also go into the chat, and then we'll just save some time at the end for that. So we're just going to jump right ahead here and start talking about why would we want to plan our garden with bees in mind. So really to think about that, we really want to think, to answer that question, we want to think about why pollinator protection might be important. And you may have heard this, but last year we had this crazy historic loss. 60 to 90% of commercial beekeepers lost, they lost that percentage of their colonies. So it was a huge, huge, huge year. In recent years, overall, I would say a lower loss would be something like 48%. We used to have the Bee Informed Partnership that would take an annual survey and try to collect some of that information. And they would, kind of on average, it was about 48%. In general, seems like some sources will say that 60% average loss is kind of a little closer to the real average. So if you are a beekeeper and you're struggling to keep bees alive through the winter, you are not alone. Um, it's interesting to hear these some of our board members or some people that work with PSC talk about historically what has kind of been the case. And we have beekeepers who've been doing this maybe they've been a beekeeper for 40 years, or maybe they are the third generation beekeeper. And really, what we've seen is that more of a typical loss rate, if you were looking at something like 30 years ago, would be like 10% losses. So this is not normal. It's the new normal, but it's not historically normal. Uh, I attended and at this conference in Copenhagen this year, Apimondia, which is an international association for bees, and that it happens every other year. And I was lucky enough to be selected to present about PSC's educational programs. And I spent one of the days of the conference just really sitting in presentation after presentation. They're about 15 minutes long, most of them, so there's quite a number. Hearing about pesticide impacts on pollinators from researchers around the world. And so this is a picture I took because I thought this was kind of a interesting slide. It was really interesting to hear about losses and the reputation of losses in the US from perspectives outside of the US. That's not something that I get to see very often. And so this was one of the slides: 60% loss in the US, 30% in Latin America, and 16% overall in Europe. So this is this is what is accepted and understood across the globe, is that the U.S. has a lot bigger loss rate than other parts of the world. So there's really big differences in pollinator survival. Overall, I think pollinators are in trouble worldwide, but in the U.S., we're particularly vulnerable here. One reason for this is that agricultural policies and pesticide regulations really are different around the world. So this can really influence how landscapes can support pollinators and support biodiversity. So really, we're kind of looking at this through the lens of the way that we grow food and manage environmental risks can really affect pollinators. Ecosystems and ultimately human health. We've gotten a bit involved in trying to write petitions and that sort of thing to the Maha Commission, because that is the idea with that commission is that they are supposed to be protecting human health. And so we've been trying to write some present some research so that we can say, look, this is happening to pollinators, and pollinators are kind of like the canary in the coal mine, right? Of what's happening and what's affecting humans, right? When we see these detrimental effects to pollinators, we are also receiving that as humans. So how do pesticides impact pollinators? I'm just going to spend a couple minutes on this and then jump right into strategies with gardening. So acute, so there's these different categories. We have acute, synergistic, food availability, and chronic exposure. These are different routes of exposure and how they might impact. Bees are and pollinators are a little different. So acute is what we imagine when we think of like a losses, or even when we think of like the bee kills that when we say, we had this massive loss last year, what we mostly imagine is these acute situations where something gets sprayed and bees die. Like they die pretty immediately, maybe in the next hour or two or something. And that's an example of acute exposure. And this is really, though, not how most bees are lost. We also see some synergistic exposure. So maybe a couple of pesticides are not that terribly toxic to bees individually, but together they have a compounded effect that makes them exponentially worse, right? More toxic effects in combination than alone. And then we also have food availability. This is one that's not, I think, as well known. So when we have something like an herbicide like dicamba, which is it's kind of like the new Roundup, where they'll have dicamba resistant like soybeans. So soybeans are grown to be resistant to dicamba. Dicamba is sprayed everywhere to suppress weeds, right? So that the soybeans can grow on their own. What happens with that is it drifts, and then when we have that used in fields, those right of ways and the forests and the buffer zone around the where that crop is being grown reduces the number of flowering plants. So it affects all of the native plants, and actually it also affects what farmers are growing next door, right, or next to that field. So what happens then is it reduces the amount of food that's available for pollinators, and that can make their survival more difficult. And then we have chronic exposure. And this is really the thing that I think is we don't think of, but is actually as research has been showing to have like the biggest impact. So this is the most common route of exposure, and it is responsible for the most losses. And though I think a good way I've heard some board members describe this as death by 1,000 cuts, and also compare it to lead poisoning in humans. And I think that's really true. That when we think about lead poisoning, most people didn't weren't exposed to some massive amount of lead poisoning, that they had an acute exposure, right, in which they, had all this exposure and then they immediately died. What mostly has happened with lead poisoning, right, is that it was chronic exposure to lower levels, not enough to kill us at one time, but slow exposure over time, and it built up in our, in systems, and ultimately can, caused all of these problems and resulted in death, right? So this is kind of where most of the pesticide exposure that we're seeing tends to fall into this chronic exposure category. So neonics are one of the big ones right now that we are concerned about. So um, they, in the big picture, are sort of relatively new, and like a lot of different chemistries, they were kind of seen as being the new and improved version. So maybe not as toxic as things in the past, but of course, over time, kind of turns out they really aren't super great, and have all these sort of catastrophic kind of effects. So one of the big things that we're concerned about is that we have really massive quantities of neonics in our environment. Millions of pounds of the chemical are applied, 140 commercial crops every year. And this happens in a variety of application methods. One of them is seed coatings. So in the United States, pretty much all corn, all field planted corn that you purchase, if it is conventionally grown corn, and 2/3 of soybeans use neonic coated seeds. So the neonic coated seeds, they're sort of prophylactically coated with this neonics, and the idea is then they're planted, and then it will give the plant some protection as it's growing, and it we'll talk about this a little bit more later in this presentation, just really briefly. But one thing to note about this is that the neonic seed coatings are not seen in the United States as a pesticide application. They are seen in a different way, because it's not being sprayed, it's being coated, and it's just some a kind of loophole language in the way that our pesticide regulation works. But what that means is that it's not tracked. The data isn't tracked. So we don't know how many pounds of neonics are being applied as seed coatings. It's just really in our environment and our water system and our air and our soil, all kinds of stuff. We see it all over from coast to coast. And there was a peer-reviewed study that found that the American landscape has become 48 times more toxic to insects since the 1990s, and that has really the majority of that is really about the application of neonics. So the global consensus is that neonics cause harm through chronic sublethal exposure over time. And so when I say global consensus, I mean this is what peer-reviewed research and scientific research is showing us. Unfortunately, that's not what necessarily regulatory agencies have consensus upon. Some, but not all. And we do see some, like in certain states in the US, have banned neonic seed coatings, or have regulations related to neonics. This is relatively new, where states are kind of taking this on, because it's been really challenging to get any change at the federal level. We can see impacts documented on honeybees, native pollinators, birds, and we see it in soil, water, pollen, nectar, and wax. Like it's all we see it persisting in there. And then in the US, right, we haven't seen nearly as much pesticide regulation reform as we think the PSC is needed to protect bees and people. One more thing. So, just if you're new to learning about neonics, we could talk for hours on that topic alone, but they were basically introduced in the late 90s. We started seeing some colony collapse. A handful of years later, actually, one of our PSC board members is known to sort of have discovered colony collapse disorder, Dave Hackenberg, in the United States in like 2006, 2007. It was initially used on some smaller number of crops, but now it's widespread across, not only ag, but also things like, golf courses, turf, tree crops, or the seed coatings, all kinds of stuff. We still don't really have a comprehensive US ban or phase out plan. There's still no accounting of beekeeper exposure. That's not really something that is we still don't that's not really still part of the conversation, and we continue to see an increase in use, and that chronic exposure is really driving the losses. And pollinators are super important for our food system, right? They're responsible for 1 in 3 of every bites of food that we eat. So that's something that we can't really have our modern food system without pollinators. And so we really want to grow food with the safety and security of them in mind, because that ensures future food access for us. At the very least, there's a lot of reasons we want to garden to protect pollinators, but at the very least, we can think of it as like we need food, and if we want to protect our food system. Okay, so let's talk about some ways to do that. So we have garden methods. One way to do this is to plant a variety of flowers and flowering plants. So different flowers are going to attract different pollinators. The PSC, works to protect, both managed and native pollinators. And so it's good to plant a variety of pollinators because, or flowers, because you want to attract different types of pollinators. We're not just talking about honeybees here, right? So bees will typically collect one type of pollen during a foraging trip. So one way to help bees is you could plant some clumps of a single species, like three by three. Well, that's actually more like a square that's 3 feet. That will attract more of them. So, but even if you have like single plants, they can be found and enjoyed by pollinators. So an easy way to do this for backyard gardeners is to do this in a veggie garden, and to plant flowers at the end of each bed or row. So on our place, I love flowers. I love flowers because they support pollinators. I also just love flowers because they're beautiful and they bring me joy when I'm in the garden space. I am not really the type of person that tends to plant a lot of ornamental plants. I tend to like plants that are provide food if I'm going to plant things. So a workaround for this is that I just plant flowers at the end of every bed or row. We at our place we have 4 foot wide beds, and they are between 40 and 60 feet long, depending where they're at. And so we just plant them at patches. I would say 3 foot by 3 foot, which is more like 9 square feet, at the beginning and end of all the rows. We also sometimes have like volunteer flowers growing in amongst the beds, and that's totally fine. We just let them do their thing. And what that can do is it brings this like lovely, beautiful environment without setting aside something specifically for ornamental flowers. And it also invites pollinators to your garden where you're growing vegetables. And depending on what you're growing, you may really, really rely on bees to pollinate those veggie flowers in order to, or fruit, in order to in order to get food. So that can be an easy way to support pollinators. Another one is to water your plants regularly. Now, by regularly, I don't mean to necessarily every day. I think if it's a container, you want to water that a little more often for sure. But most garden practices are going to recommend infrequent but deep watering. So it's still fine to do that. You might water, maybe only a couple times, 3 times a week, but you want to water nice and deeply. And you can use drip irrigation or their water saving method to apply the water directly to the roots. This one is a really good one, mulching your garden. So mulch is going to help to retain moisture in the soil, and also can provide a habitat for ground nesting pollinators. So you want to use a layer of organic amount mulch around plants to reduce that evaporation. You can also set out, there's like we've had some, I posted some like social media posts about this, like little like kind of bee bath, little containers of water with a couple of rocks in them. If it's, really hot out and you don't have any natural kind of bodies of water where your bees might go, you can also kind of set out these. It's kind of like a bird bath, but smaller, and it's a little bee bath, and that can go right into your garden, and you can refill it when you're watering. Another thing that we don't often think about is how soil health is really going to overall impact pollinators. And that's kind of like kind of a bigger picture kind of situation. Too much to go into in this short workshop, but I will just say that soil health is incredibly important, and absolutely a component of providing a supportive environment for pollinators. And one way that you can do that is you could switch to no-till. So no-till gardens are just like what they sound. We're not tilling the soil. Sometimes you might till it once or something to get it kind of set up so that you can switch to this. But essentially, the idea is that you are layering up and building there's two different things. Lasagna is what we're seeing here. The bottom picture, you'll see a classic kind of lasagna cross section where we see this layered up cardboard, then some straw, then some food waste, then some manure, then some straw, so you're kind of layering it up like a lasagna. You can do that and to create a no-till method. And so every year you're just going to keep adding some mulch onto that. Another option is to just start by no-till, and so you would plant your garden, and then you would use a combination of things like mulch, cover crops. You might do tarping, where you lay down a tarp to kill all of the weeds that are in the soil, so it helps them kind of decompose, and it just kind of turns what might be a crazy, kind of grassy area into something that is plantable. And you're really doing something that kind of mimics nature. And whenever we can do things that mimic nature, we are going to typically have a better outcome than some of our conventional kind of human-led systems for growing food. So if you look in, like I'm in the Pacific Northwest, I'm looking out at this like big forest that's around my house, and if I look out into the forest, I don't see a monocrop of one type of food or one type of plant being grown in rows and all that kind of stuff. What I'm seeing is this forest where, I've got some conifers and some deciduous trees, and the conifers, their leaves will drop and they'll cover the ground, and plants will grow. And if I look out, I don't really see any big patches of bare earth. In nature, we don't typically see that. We see covered ground. It's not good to have uncovered soil because it depletes the soil. There's all kinds of things that it can do when you have all this exposed soil. So we want to, in no-till, really keep the ground covered all the time with mulch or with plants. And that is, I've got a lot of information on no-till. If you're interested, you're welcome. I'll give my contact information at the end, and I can provide some extra materials on some resources on how you might go about doing that. Okay, so moving onward, crop selection and varietal section, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about some integrated pest management practices and some seed saving practices. So, crop and varietal selection, one thing to note is, some folks will know this, annuals are going to complete their life cycle in one season. Biennials completed over two growing seasons. Perennials can grow for many years. An example of annual would be like, in my climate, I might have lettuce. I would plant a lettuce seed. It is going to grow. It's going to make lettuce. If I don't harvest the entire plant to eat, If I just, leave the plant to grow, it is going to at some point bolt. It's going to send up a flower head, and the flower is going to turn into seed. And by the end of that same growing season, if I planted lettuce in, May, by September, I'm going to have seed that is available that I could harvest and then plant the next year. So that's an annual. Biennials would be something like kale. So I plant kale, say, in April, and kale grows lovely the whole season. I can either take it and put it in a protected area at the end of the fall, or if I'm in an area with like kind of mild winters, I could leave the kale out in the garden the whole winter. And then it will kind of be a little dormant. It's not going to die back all the way, but it won't really be making a bunch of food for me necessarily. It's going to be kind of, resting. It'll have this period of vernalization during the colder winter months. And then in the spring a full year after I planted initially, it will start sending up flowers, and those flowers will turn into seed. And usually by the end of the second season, I will have seed. So that's a biennial. Perennials, you plant once and they can grow for many, many, many years. So you want to plant species that bloom in different seasons to extend the enjoyment of the garden and to help uh, provide food for bees. So a variety of flower colors will also attract a diverse variety of bees. So you can choose some perennials that have all these different colors. Um, so I think both of these things, the planting species that bloom in different seasons, so knowing maybe planting some annuals and some biennials and some perennials, this will provide some food for bees during the entire season that they're out and about. So colorful and really different types of plants, not just, when we think about backyard gardens, we typically think about annuals, but I think that, if you're having some blueberry bushes, there's a perennial that you can include it maybe in a backyard garden kind of area, or you might have decide to grow some seed, and then there's some biennial options. So I would suggest that all of three of these have a place, even in a small backyard garden. This is something that is just, I think it's good to consider. It's not necessarily for the bees, but how are you going to use what you grow? And I think this is something that people don't often think of. I work for university and teach a lot of uh, or I design curriculum and offer classes on preserving food. And I think this is something that we don't really think about now. So I do like to include this, like considering how we're going to use what you grow. Is it just for fresh eating? You just want to have some fresh lettuce and some good carrots in the summertime. That's all of these things are great. It's one is not better than the other, but this will help you decide what to plant. So are you planning to freeze or can or pickle or ferment or dry any of the produce that you're growing? Are you hoping to store long term for, like a microclimate, like an unheated garage or something, for things like root vegetables or potatoes? What's the most important quality for your needs? Is it flavor? Is it production? What kind of thing? And are you hoping to save seed? These things are going to help inform the varietal selection for what you're growing. And this is just a slide that kind of gives an example of these um, different ways that seed catalogs can be used to help you decide what varieties might be the most useful. So in both of these situations, these are both biennials. So they're going to make their flowers, which are going to, be bee food in the second year. Looking at both of these, this is not a seed saving class, so we can't really get into this, but I will just say that the one on the left, which says open pollinated, is the type that you could reliably save seed for. The one on the right says F1 hybrid. If something is a hybrid, backyard gardeners generally want to avoid trying to save the seed of that, because F1 hybrids have been bred from two different parents, and this is their offspring. And the genetics are not stable, so it won't necessarily breed true. So if you plant the seed from this F1 hybrid, the child of these two parents, you don't know what necessarily you're going to get. It may look quite different from the food that you grew. But open pollinated foods, the one on the left, that is a good indicator that you can save the seed. It will reproduce what you have just saved the seed from. Okay, so when we're looking at this, This particular slide is from a deck that I use for food preservation. And so this one shows, outstanding for cooking and winter storage. I've got that highlighted. So this helps us to identify if I want to have carrots that I'm going to freeze and put in the freezer or do some canning, or I'm going to store, in my unheated garage. This would be a good variety to select. And then cabbage, we see here, not a great keeper. I've got that highlighted. A good flavor for such a biggie, makes great sauerkraut. So this is not something that I might try to store in an unheated garage for a couple of months after harvest. It's also maybe not something that I'm going to want to plant if I'm going to be gone for about a month, when this might become ripe, because it's not going to maybe, hold up in the field very well. It might crack. But if I want to make some fall sauerkraut, this might be a good thing to do. So, so I think that information is good in trying to determine what variety you want to select. And then if you want to add bee and pollinator support to that criteria of, how are you going to use food, what's important to you about growing food, then saving seed that open pollinated is going to be a criteria that you're going to want to pay attention to. Some other ways that you can garden that are going to increase your yield and also potentially give some support to pollinators is, you could do some things like do succession planting, where you're planting the same crop at a couple, like 2-week intervals. Let's go to the next one here. And intercropping or polyculture. I think this one is super, super important for pollinator support. This is more than one species grown at the same time, place, in proximity as others. And this is what we see when we look at a natural landscape, a natural ecosystem. We don't see a monocrop with rows of corn or rows of one type of plant. What we see is just a mix, all different kinds of things growing together. Now, in a backyard garden, you may need to be a little more organized than that. You may not want, if you've got one bed, you may not want to have 10 different things planted in one bed. That's okay if that's not the thing that works for you, but you could have several things planted in one bed, like the flowers at the end, always including some kind of flowering plant. You could choose to do some, in a bed, you could have some flowering plants, or some flowers at one end, and you could say, okay, I'm going to grow some lettuce at this section and some beans in this section. And the lettuce, I'm going to harvest some, but I'm going to leave some to develop seed. And so that's going to be some flowers later on in the season for the bees. So polyculture really lends itself well to plants flowering at different times, and that will help support bees and pollinators. Another thing, this is generally good for improved soil health. And so it also reduces diseases and pests. And so integrated pest management is really a component of gardening in a safe way for pollinators, because we want to avoid having to treat with any kind of chemicals, whether it's organic or not, for any pests or diseases. So we want our garden to be as healthy as possible, because part of supporting bees is having little to no need for those interventions for diseases and pests. So crop rotation, and all these practices are support that. I'm just going to say the no-till and the polyculture and the succession planting. Those are all parts, elements of kind of some integrated pest management practices, where you are growing food in a way that minimizes risks of diseases and pests. So crop rotation is one. Basically, you're changing the location of plant families from season to season. This is going to be easier or harder depending on what your growing setup is. Like I have a tomato greenhouse. I can't move, this massive greenhouse around every year. The tomatoes just have to live in there. I also grow some tomatoes outside, and I do change the location of those every year, but I'm limited, right? Like I have this unmovable kind of greenhouse. And so there's going to be some situations like that where it's not practical to switch things around. But when you can, doing changing the location of those plant families is going to be good for the soil, a good part of integrated pest management, and is going to support bee health. So integrated pest management, it's for those, if this is a unfamiliar term, for those of you, this is basically this approach to pest management that relies on a combination of these certain practices. So This is one of, I mean, I can send you some information on this if you're interested. This is just a little infographic. I think this is from the Entomological Society of America. Yeah. And these kind of an infographic or overview of IPM can look a little bit differently. Sometimes you'll see, oh, these are these four, kind of main components of it. Sometimes it's five, but essentially it has some real commonalities. Basically, you would identify and monitor. So if I have a apple tree and I start seeing some, moths on the apple tree, or I start seeing, maybe I've noticed that there's some damage. And so the next year I'm going to pay attention to what's going on with that. And then I'm going to use that data and evaluate. So if this was instead of an apple tree, let's go with something that's a little more short term, that's a backyard garden kind of thing. Maybe I have um, a kale plant, and I noticed that there are holes in the leaves of my kale plant. And I take a look and I notice, okay, here's some slugs around, but actually this doesn't really look like maybe slugs are causing this kind of damage. And then I pay a little more attention and I realize, oh, there's these little flea beetles, these little black bugs on them. And then I look it up and okay, these are flea beetles. So I'm going to then evaluate, like figure out, right, is the pest causing the damage? And then do I need to act? So flea beetles are an interesting one. That's a pest that, presents a challenge for me. If the kale plants are little, they're like little babies. I've, maybe started some in the greenhouse and then I put them out in the garden and they're maybe, 4 to 6 inches tall. Flea beetles are going to cause a lot more damage to them. And so I need to be really like pay a lot of attention. And if a treatment needs to happen, it may have to happen at that stage because when they're young and tender, those flea beetles could potentially decimate and kill plants. However, if the plants are big, mature plants, and they are, 2 foot tall and they are, full size, some flea beetles on them are probably not going to cause that big of a problem. So I can accept some, a few holes in some leaves if I'm just, eating those and enjoying them. It's not that big of a deal as long as those numbers kind of stay in, that damage kind of stays in balance. So it says as pest numbers increase toward the economic threshold, further treatments may be necessary. So you don't always need to act every time you see some damage. Sometimes you can just be like, I'm just gonna wait and see how bad this. Okay, well, I'll try these like different little interventions, and I'm not gonna spray. I'm not gonna do anything like that. I'll just see. And sometimes, most of the time, in fact, I feel like you can in the backyard garden kind of stay at this level that will you don't have to really do anything, just monitoring. And again, if you're doing these growing practices, if you're using these growing practices that support healthy soil, that support healthy plants, then that in and of itself is often enough to keep that at a nice balance. So then we say number three says prevent. So some pest problems can be prevented from using resistant plants, planting early, rotating crops, using barriers against certain kinds of pests, sorry, and that might be something like a floating row cover, also like a fabric like Remay or something, better sanitation. So that's something that I use all of these prevention strategies. That's what things like crop rotation and good soil health and no-till and all this kind of stuff. This is a prevention. These are all prevention methods. Okay, so and you might add or change some of those year to year depending on what's happening with your garden. So then we have action. So IPM uses multiple tools to reduce pests. But if starting to get to be too much damage to the level that you're going to start losing things, and so this then in that category we have mechanical controls, biological controls, and overall we want to have like really responsible use. I almost never spray at anything. I would only use organic sprays, but I almost never ever spray. I as like something that I would like a product that I would purchase or something. I find that most of the things can be done with like mechanical controls. Something even those flea beetles, for example, there are definitely organic pesticides that will kill those flea beetles. But actually, what I found works really well is to use one of those barriers. like a floating row cover. I, do intercropping so that there's different things growing so that it doesn't just, focus all on the kale. I make it a little more difficult where they have to kind of seek out the kale plants because I plant other things interspersed around that. And then another thing is if it got really bad, honestly, I vacuum the kale. I know that sounds weird. The first time that I vacuumed the garden, it was really hilarious. But I just use a little rechargeable. Now I use a little rechargeable, like a car vacuum, and I just walk around and I vacuum all of those off the plants, and it basically keeps the numbers at a low enough and interrupts their life cycle. I also use beneficial nematodes in the ground, usually an application once a year, so that they have some natural enemies that will eat them at their larval stage. So there's like some different things that you can do. And meanwhile, pollinators are really supported in that environment because I'm not spraying anything, not even organic stuff. So IPM, I think, is really critical. And this is where just like paying attention and really noticing what's going on in your garden and taking some notes. It can be as simple as a little garden journal. If you're not a big note taker, you could make little, notes on your phone or take a picture and keep a notes uh, list or something of different things that you're seeing, and that will inform how you can improve your practices moving forward. Okay, if you need to use a product for pests, or if you're considering that, the first thing I would recommend is to look for this OMRI label. Now, you can also go to the OMRI website or contact the manufacturer. If you have a product that you think is could be used that's an organic certified product, not all of them are actually going to have an OMRI certification, or I'm sorry, an OMRI icon on the label. Actually, there's a surcharge. I think manufacturers have to pay OMRI some very small amount per label to use that to have the little icon on there. And so I do know that there are some companies that are like smaller companies who are like, oh well, we don't want to pay for that. We paid for the certification. They're on the website. They're on the list, so you can use them, but you just they don't say it. So you can always check if you're unsure. Now in general, we're gonna see that OMRI, like organic certified products, are generally going to be overall less damaging to pollinators, but organic pesticides are still pesticides. And these are really need to be seen, even organic, as a very last resort. So here's an example, pyrethrin. It's a compound extracted from the chrysanthemum flower. It basically it affects the insect's nervous system and it's very toxic. It's very effective. It can kill lots of different things. If you have flea shampoo for your pets, it very likely has that. It also could have neonics in it, but so it can kill a lot of things that you don't want to have in your garden, but it also can kill insects, beneficial insects, including bees. And bees are not the only type of beneficial insect that you have in your garden. Uh, you can have organic or non-organic. The non-organic is often mixed with some kind of other toxicochemical to enhance effectiveness, but both of them are going to have the same, detrimental effect on bees. This is just something to look out for in general. This is why we want to really focus on all of these IPM strategies so that you just don't even have to get to that point, so that your plants are healthy and we just don't even have to figure out like, oh, okay, I'm gonna have to spray, and is this one good for bees or not? Like if you can just not have to spray, that's the easiest. Okay, so let me look how I'm doing on time. Okay, pretty good. So in terms of thinking about growing food without neonics, it's we need farmers. Farmers are you know like it's a tough job right now being a farmer. I think it always has, but it's particularly challenging right now. We see really not enough people going into farming, and PSC really supports farmers. In fact, a lot of our past, board members and things have also had, some sort of farming endeavor in addition to being like a commercial beekeeper, right? Unfortunately, what we have seen is this kind of unfortunate situation with commercial producers where they, even if a commercial farm would like to plant corn, remember corn was one of the ones that, it's mostly planted with this treated seed. Even if they wanted to plant corn without that treated seed, it can be incredibly difficult for them because if they want to get crop insurance, oftentimes neonic treated seed is a requirement for them to get the crop insurance. And you can imagine that the reason that that's a requirement is because of some lobbying efforts on the part of the chemical companies who are selling the treated seeds. So um, farmers are often stuck kind of between a rock and a hard place. And what we're really trying to work on is not, penalizing farmers, not vilifying them, but trying to work on changing the regulatory system so that they can have the tools they need to grow the food that we need. And they can do it in a way that is like economically viable for them. So when we look at this is a study from Cornell. At you know, Corn and soybean production in the EU didn't decline. They banned neonics in 2018. In general, they have a few situations in which you can use them, but overall they've very very much reduced neonic use. So you can see that their pre-neonic and post-neonic numbers really are the same. Little to no benefits, independent research shows. Cornell University saw 89% of trials showed no benefit compared to no insecticide use at all. So one interesting option is that in Canada and Quebec, they you can apply like neonics on crops, but you have to show a demonstrated need. Like you've tried you have integrated pest management plan, you've tried all the things, and this is the last. You're going to lose your crop. You really do need to apply this, and then it's kind of a prescription based application. So you would have to show need. And then you could, if you really do need it. And then, so that also, as you might imagine, greatly reduces the amount of neonic application. And so I think there are ways that we could grow food that are strikes that nice balance of supporting pollinators and human health, but also allowing farmers to do the work that they are doing in a way that is economically viable for them. Okay, so another thing that you can do is save seed. So you can easily save seed from lots of different veggies, flowers, and herbs. An easy way to begin is to start with one of those open pollinated varieties. If you have some seed and you're not sure if it's open pollinated, you can go ahead and look it up online, like your seed catalog, that kind of thing. It should say if it's open pollinated. Now, the people who are attending live, if I'm at the end, let's see here. Actually, if you could just do me a favor and put your the name that you registered under. If you could just message me on the chat, that would be super helpful because people who are attending live will receive some free seed packets, and all of those seeds that you would be receiving they're all open pollinated, so you can save the seed for all of those things. These seeds are, these open pollinated annuals are going to make their seed at the end of the growing cycle, and they generally are going to require very little processing. So when to save seed, we talked about this already. Annuals are going to make their seed at the end of one growing season. Biennials are going to make it in the second year. So they require that vernalization, that cold winter period in between the first growing season and then the second season, which is dedicated to producing seed. So how to tell when seed is ready? This is going to look really different depending on the type of plant. This is a calendula flower, and so I just picked this one at random. Really, it's going to be something that you're going to want to you just look up. You're going to just want to pay attention. And over the years, if you start collecting seed, you'll get more familiar with the different varieties and what what mature seed looks like. I've got some resources at the end. I've got a free seed saving, or I think it's maybe the next slide, a free seed saving zine that you might take a look at and download that has some of this information. But basically, we're seeing that the bud is very early stage of development, and then the bloom. Here we have the calendula flower. The seed is still in the early stages. And then the petals will kind of dry and drop off, and we see that the young seed is present, but it's still immature. And if I were to take the seed, even though it's not totally done, if I was to take some of that and try to plant it, what I would find is that probably some of the seeds would germinate because they might be a little bit further along in the cycle, but many of the seeds would not. And so I might only, I'm just making this up, I might only get 10% germination rate. So one out of every 10 seeds would germinate. But if I let it mature entirely, then we see that the cycle is complete and most or all the seeds are ready for harvest. And then I could expect something more along the lines of, 80 to 100% germination, right? So, so you're going to want to make sure that you're harvesting at the right time. And in this situation, all we're doing is like this is a very easy one to save. You can see those kind of seeds present in that photo at the last. I'm sorry, it should not say bud, it should say seed. And you would just they kind of crumble off in your hand, and then you just make sure that they're super dry, and then put them in your little envelope or glass jar for the winter and plant them the next year. Okay, so I will put some of these, I'll put the links to this seed saving publication, this guide to seed saving, seed stewardship, and seed sovereignty. This I have nothing to do with this particular zine, but I've shared it with a lot of folks. It can be a really good. It's free and downloadable and covers a lot of the different types of plants that you might grow in your backyard garden. If you have access to a library, here's a couple of other seed saving books that are pretty good. And I just like to throw this book out there. This is kind of a fun book, Eating to Extinction. Actually, it's not really a fun book. It's really kind of a, it's all about the loss of biodiversity. So I don't know how fun it is, but the author makes it really interesting because each of the chapters is really kind of like a case study, and he just talks about why certain foods are like the history of a certain food, why it is culturally relevant, how it is produced, and what we stand to lose when we lose that at-risk food. And if you are interested in this book, I highly recommend the like Audible version, the audiobook, because the author reads it and it's really great. And you can just kind of pick up and choose different chapters at a time. You don't necessarily have to have the whole book in order. So I can share some of these resources. Another thing you want to do is promote regenerative and organic farming practices. So long-term studies show that really these regenerative systems can match conventional yields. So we don't have to give up, corn at this, we grow quite a bit of food per acre now compared to what we did, 200 years ago. But we don't have to give up those high yields. We could do this and have very similar outcomes with regenerative methods. Regenerative is a little different than organic. Organic is part of it, but regenerative is with the idea of really building soil health as the foundation, the foundational component. Organic is just like we're not going to use anything with these certain chemicals in them, but it often looks quite a bit, or it can look quite a bit like conventional, but just using organic certified products. I think it can be better than conventional, but regenerative is like the next level of that. I think that that's something that you might be interested in looking into a little bit more. And really, when we're talking about regenerative practices, pollinators are absolutely a component of that. And that's something that is when a regenerative farmer is kind of designing their methodology, pollinators are considered, whereas that's not really the case when you're talking about necessarily a certain conventionally grown crops. Okay, so this let's see here. I'm trying to think of it. Okay, so this link I think brings you to PSC. We have some free educational materials online that are available for download. So please feel free to check those out and download and distribute those things. We also are available to do presentations if you belong to like a bee club or something. We have some presentations if you're interested in pesticide impact on pollinators. And sometimes I can get a board member we have some of our more well-known board members are, like I mentioned, Dave Hackenberg, who discovered colony collapse disorder, and Brett Ady, who has the largest beekeeping operation in the US. Sometimes I can get one of those board members to help present if that's of interest. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me and I'm gonna go ahead in the chat right now. I'm going to put my email. I think it's listed on the sign up, but I'll just put in here real quick. So there is the contact, and then I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to try to get the seed saving link for you. Give me one quick second. I should have had that pulled up. There we go. And if you are interested, I usually teach a seed saving workshop um, um, through PSC once a year. I'll probably teach it a little later in the season. So if you're interested in that, just be on the lookout for it. Let's see here. Okay, so here is the link to where you can find the seed saving guide. Um, okay. Are there any questions before we go?